August 14th, 2005, a strange and terrifying guest was hovering in the skies of Athens, the capital of Greece. About 10,000 meters above the ground, a passenger plane was silently circling without making contact with anyone. The frightening thing was that for the past 2 hours, this plane had not responded to any messages from control towers. Fear had spread through the atmosphere of Athens. Was this the preparation for a terrorist attack, or was it a hijacking event? Because of this fear, the Greek Air Force immediately dispatched its fighter jets to pursue it. When the fighter jets got close to the plane, they witnessed a shocking scene inside. It was discovered that there was complete silence inside the plane. No movement, no activity at all. All the passengers were sitting lifelessly in their seats, and there was no one present in the cockpit either. At that moment, the F-16 pilot saw a person in the plane's cockpit who didn't appear to be the pilot. He was moving around inside the cockpit as if searching for something or trying to figure something out. The very next moment, the plane suddenly tilted to one side and began descending rapidly towards the ground. Just a few minutes later, it crashed into the mountains north of Athens. In this accident, all 121 passengers and crew members perished. But what was the real story behind all of this? Why was there no movement inside the plane? Why weren't the pilots and crew members responding to any calls? And what happened inside after takeoff that later led to such a horrific accident? This is the story of Helios Flight 522, which is also known as the Ghost Plane. Welcome once again to Jim TV's videos. Viewers, on the morning of August 14th, 2005, 115 passengers and 6 crew members boarded Helios Flight 522 at Larnaca Airport in Cyprus. Their final destination was the city of Prague in the Czech Republic, but they had a stopover in Athens along the way. It was summertime, and most of the people were heading out from Cyprus for vacations, planning to disembark in Athens. The captain of this flight was a highly experienced individual. At 59 years old, he had over 17,000 hours of flying experience. The first officer was also 51 years old and had spent 7,500 hours in the air. Usually, in such accidents, the focus is on the crew's expertise, but in this case, the story was a bit different. These two pilots had flown together on several flights before, and the first officer had often complained to his friends and family about the captain's pressure and strict behavior. He had even reported it to the airline. The airline was also already aware of this issue. Not only that, but the first officer's training record also revealed that he had difficulty with checklist procedures. This was something that would later prove to be the most important factor of all. The plane was a 7-year-old Boeing 737-300. In the cool morning air, the aircraft took off from Larnaca Airport without any issues. As soon as the plane climbed above 10,000 feet, Cario contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control, and the captain requested permission to fly at 34,000 feet, which was granted. However, as soon as the aircraft reached an altitude of 12,000 feet, an alarm suddenly started sounding in the cockpit. This was the same alarm that would often sound on the ground before takeoff when there was an issue with the aircraft's takeoff configuration. That's why both pilots were surprised to hear it while in the air. 90 seconds later, the captain contacted his airline's operations center and informed them about the takeoff configuration warning. He also mentioned that the ventilation cooling fan lights were off, and further asked where its circuit breakers were located. The engineer on the ground replied that those lights should be off anyway, and that the circuit breaker is located behind the captain's seat. When the engineer asked the captain to confirm the issue, the captain said that it was not off. The pilot's response made no sense to the engineer at all. At that moment, the engineer suddenly remembered something. Before the flight, the same engineer had checked the aircraft's pressurization system, because the controls for that system were located near the controls the captain was giving confusing answers about. That's why the engineer asked the captain whether the pressurization mode was set to auto or manual. But instead of answering, the captain repeated the same question: where are the circuit breakers located? During this conversation, the passengers' oxygen masks inside the plane had dropped down. Shortly after that, Helios ground operations lost contact with the plane. In no time, the aircraft reached 34,000 feet, and now all attempts to contact it were failing. Helios operations then contacted Nicosia Air Traffic Control and asked them to try to contact Flight 522. For the next 5 minutes, the controller tried to reach the plane, but there was no response. Then the controller contacted another aircraft near Flight 522 and asked them to try to make contact with Flight 522, but this method also failed. Meanwhile, Flight 522 had already entered Greek airspace without permission and continued to follow its flight plan. Nicosia Air Traffic Control Tower also tried to contact Flight 522 on the emergency frequency, but there was still no response from there. Then they contacted Athens ATC in Greece and asked whether they had managed to establish contact with Flight 522 or not. But unfortunately, there was no response to their radio calls from the aircraft either. At this point, there were two possibilities. Either Flight 522 was experiencing a radio transmission problem, which meant they could hear the calls but were unable to transmit a response, or both pilots had been taken hostage. Considering the first possibility, the Athens control tower gave the aircraft permission to descend, but there was no indication from Flight 522 that it was descending. After more than 20 attempts to make contact went unanswered, the Athens ATC was forced to contact the Greek Air Force and informed them that Flight 522 had entered the airspace without permission and was also not responding to messages. The Greek Air Force immediately dispatched 2 F-16 jets to intercept. At that time, Flight 522 was perfectly following its flight path on autopilot. The point where it was supposed to descend had already been missed twice, but the plane was still flying at 34,000 feet. At 7:37 a.m., Flight 522 established a holding pattern over Athens Airport. A holding pattern is when a plane circles above the airport, and upon receiving permission, begins its landing approach. When they were on the 6th round of the holding pattern, both F-16s intercepted them. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning when one of the pilots from the 2 F-16s gave a rather astonishing report. He said that the captain's seat in the cockpit of Flight 522 was empty. They also looked inside the passenger cabin. In the light coming from the windows on the other side, they could see the cabin clearly. The passengers were sitting completely motionless in their seats, with oxygen masks on their faces. As the plane was making its 10th round in the holding pattern, one of the F-16 pilots saw a strange sight. A man wearing a light blue shirt and a black vest entered the cockpit and sat down in the captain's seat. He also put on the headphones, placed his hands on the panel in front of him. The pilot signaled to the person in the cockpit, and he responded by waving back. But just moments later, the plane's left engine shut down. After that, the plane quickly tilted to the left and began descending toward the ground. He sat in the captain's seat, put on the headphones, and placed his hands on the panel in front of him. The pilot signaled to the person in the cockpit, and he responded by waving back. But just moments later, the plane's left engine shut down, after which the plane quickly tilted to the left and began descending toward the ground. Just before 9 in the morning, the plane turned further to the left, and after that, it's about 4 minutes later, it crashed into the mountains northwest of Athens and was destroyed. The right engine also shut down. About 4 minutes later, it crashed into the mountains northwest of Athens and was destroyed. Immediately after the accident, investigators got to work. They examined the wreckage and also questioned the engineer who had performed maintenance on the plane before the accident. The night before the crash, this same engineer had conducted a pressurization leak test on the aircraft. During this test, he had switched the pressurization mode on the overhead panel from auto to manual, but after finishing his work, he forgot to switch it back to auto. The plane was flying at an altitude of 34,000 feet, and because it was set to manual, the air pressure inside the cabin began to decrease. In low pressure, the human brain can only function for about 10 minutes, and this condition is called hypoxia, meaning hypoxia impairs the brain. Pilots overlook the manual switch, ignoring 2 subsequent warnings, but they missed every opportunity. When the plane climbed above 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude warning alarm started to sound. However, instead of focusing on the pressurization system, the pilot's attention was on the takeoff configuration. They missed every chance. At 12,000 feet, the cabin alarm sounded, but the pilots mistook it for a takeoff warning. Distracted, they performed runway procedures and ignored the real issue. The oxygen masks dropped down and the pass oxygen light turned on, but perhaps due to the initial effects of hypoxia, they didn't pay attention to this either. This was the moment when the captain and first officer lost consciousness, and after the 10-minute oxygen supply ran out, the passengers and crew also lost consciousness. Now the question arises, who was the person in the cockpit who arrived there 2 hours after they had passed out? That was flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who held a commercial pilot's license but was not qualified to fly a 737. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that Prodromou had also tried to make mayday calls after the engines failed, but he accidentally forgot to press the transmit button. The investigation board determined that he didn't have enough flying expertise to control a Boeing 737, especially after the engines had failed due to fuel exhaustion. Even if he had somehow managed to land the plane, it would still have been impossible for the passengers and crew to survive, because by that time, hypoxia would have caused irreversible damage to the brain. During the investigation, 3 out of the 4 portable oxygen cylinders were found used among the wreckage of the plane. This proved that Prodromou and possibly 2 other cabin crew members had used these cylinders, which allowed them to remain conscious longer than the other passengers and pilots. After the Helios Flight 522 accident, the aviation industry learned a lot, and several new SOPs were established, including instructions for Boeing to enhance pilot training and to clarify the differences in warnings. Since the implementation of these SOPs, an accident like Helios Flight 522 has not occurred again to this day. We hope you will also like and share this video from ASIM TV wholeheartedly. Thank you so much for your loving comments. See you in the next amazing video.